Hi, this is Phil. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm going to do a little discussion and kind of a book review about my Boys of Summer project. This is kind of a tangent that came out of my work on the Boys of Summer, which is my ongoing project about growing up in Madison in the 1950s and what the world was like there. And in the process of doing this, I've come in touch with other Boys of Summer, and in the process this has led to me to think about one of our contemporary values of diversity. And I think it is very important that diversity is part of our experience, our curriculum, that we remember some of the darker sides of American history, and yet I'm not quite satisfied. So as a result of this, working with another one of the Boys of Summer, Glenn Hovde, I got in touch with Robert Akamatsu. Robert has been a friend of mine now for, I guess, 55 or 56 years. And Robert is Japanese American. And I think I might have mentioned before that the Japanese American experience in the United States during the Second World War was a dark aspect of American history. And what I mean by this is we knew when we were growing up, and Bob was one of our friends that later played football with us in Madison East, that he in fact grew up, he was born in what we called a Japanese relocation center. I've been on the phone with him working on this project, and we wondered whether or not we should refer to it as a concentration camp. And in a sense, they weren't death camps, but he said if something walks like a duck, quacks, and has floppy feet, then maybe it's a duck. So what I'm thinking about, and I want to get a personal, human aspect to history, as I talked about last week with my associates focus group. So what I want you to picture is a day like today in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It's probably about 10 or 15 degrees above zero, and it's covered with ice, the whole streets, although we're getting rid of them. And this is what my friend was born into in 1944. The barracks were barely heated with potbelly stoves. 100,000 Japanese were relocated from the West Coast to these centers. They lost all of their property, and most of them had to go someplace after the war. Well, the reason that I can talk about this experience is I have Margaret Leonard's book, Remembering the Akamatsus. And she lived in Madison, Wisconsin, where the Akamatsus ended up living. When the war was over, Bob Sr. Took a very long bus trip all over America looking for work. And it wasn't easy then for a Japanese American to find work. And he ended up doing, I think it was a Utah to New York bus trip, and then New York to Chicago. And Mr. Akamatsu ended up in Madison, Wisconsin. Now, this was probably in 1946. Now, you should read this book, Remembering the Akamatsu Family, Infinity Press, ISBN number 07414-21280, because this book should be in every school, college, and research library in the United States. And in 40 years of book reviewing, I've never said this before, because this gives you a personal tone. And so far I've told you some pretty harrowing stuff. And many of the people that were responsible for this Japanese internment otherwise are thought of as being icons in liberal America, like Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Earl Warren, who was responsible for the Brown versus Topeka decision, which integrated school on his watch as Chief Justice. But it's not an all negative story by any means. There's a 1946 or 1947 Life magazine article that calls Madison, Wisconsin the best place to live in the country. And the only job that Mr. Akamatsu could get at that time was working as an assistant produce manager in the Piggly Wiggly food store, I think on Northport Drive in Madison, Wisconsin. Well, how do I know all that? Well, I know that because I lived it, and I also can read it in Margaret Leonard's fine book, Remembering the Akamatsus. It sort of puts a human part of it into the story. But the story gets even more interesting than that, because my grandmother and my grandfather and my mother would go shopping. My mother would take my grandfather shopping until he was well into his 80s and even into his early 90s when he was living with her. And they would always go to shop at Piggly Wiggly, where Mr. Akamatsu worked as the produce manager. And everybody thought he was the nicest man you could work for, and my grandpa really, really liked him. There are many stories in this book, and what I want to say is it's not just a narrative of victimization. It's a narrative of survival, a narrative of adjustment, a narrative of human warmth and understanding, and it's one of those good stories. Now, an American president that I'm not too fond of, Ronald Reagan, nevertheless did issue a presidential apology to all of the Japanese who were thus interned. Well, and lost all their property. And Bob is very proud of this, which is in the book. All of this stuff is in the book. And when I hear something like this, I wouldn't say I love Reagan, but I got to say that he comes out a lot better than Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren did. What more to say about this is there's a cautionary aspect to these sorts of stories, and I always worry that we teach them as if they're history. There's something that's in a book, names you have to study for on a test, and something that's very distant from you. It's not part of our present reality. Well, I have a friend who is a Japanese American who is a permanent resident, as a very fine history teacher. I've had several courses from her. And at one point we were talking about immigration status. And apparently if you're a permanent resident, then you pretty much can stay as long as you want to. And I don't know the technicalities of it, somebody can correct me, but you're pretty much all right. But I want to point out that the lowest immigration status that any of the Japanese Americans who were moved from their homes in California and the West Coast to these relocation centers had was resident alien, and most of them were American citizens. And the point I mean to say by this is we should be thinking, well, if this happens to one group of American citizens, why couldn't it happen to another? And often we tell the story of the American government not keeping promises to people, promises not being kept, historical guilt assigned to people, And we sort of don't think of it again in a contemporary context. Now, a number of you maybe watch PBS, and there's a story on it. It's called Victoria. Queen Victoria is a beautiful young woman. And part of what she lives through as Queen Victoria is what they call the Irish potato famine, which I might call the Irish genocide, because it's one of the reasons why I am here right now. We emigrated. Now hold that story in your mind for a second. As I say, so I am really a famine and genocide survivor, came to the United States, and our family, by whatever means, some of it violent and some of it working through the political system, and maybe a little petty organized crime, was able to realize, I guess you would say, the American dream. And what I want to say about this, it's hard won. And when we assign guilt to America for what we call historical crimes, a lot of us weren't there when it took place. You know, I mean by this, well, for some of the, there was an example given of the worst drug that was brought into the United States. It's something called Chinese bath salts or something. And the commentator, whose name I can't remember now, said, well, that's just America's punishment for the Opium War. Well, okay, the Opium War was a historical crime where the British government fought a war to make the Chinese buy British opium in the early 1840s. And it's certainly a black mark in history. The British government was behaving like a drug game. But that's not really my black mark, is it? My family was starving in Ireland at the time. And what I worry about is sort of free-floating guilt, which is assigned to these situations that historicizes them rather than makes them think that these are contemporary issues that we all have to be careful of. Hi, this is Phil Caveney from Phil Caveney Productions, and inviting you to keep in touch. I want you to support me on YouTube. I want your Facebook likes. I'd like you to go to my blog at The Works of Phil Caveney and be in contact with me at cleofa1885gmail.com or 715-497-6369, and I will be able to Skype soon.